Adanna had always believed that marriage was not two people walking side by side, but two souls breathing as one, sharing the same burdens, and drinking from the same cup, whether sweet or bitter. When she married Percy, she did not marry a man who already had a throne. She married a dreamer, a man with visions that stretched beyond their tiny one-room apartment, a man who spoke of warehouses, trucks, and empires with such passion that his words became food in her hungry stomach. She listened to him under the flickering light of their kerosene lamp, her eyes shining not at what was, but at what could be. Love, she told herself, was not proved in comfort, but in sacrifice. And if destiny asked her to bleed for the one she loved, then so be it. For what good was love if it was never tested in fire? The days were hard, and the nights were longer. Percy came home with stories of investors who laughed at him, of banks that shut their doors in his face, and of partners who called him a small boy with big talk. Each rejection broke him, and each time he staggered home in silence, Adanna would hold him and whisper, "I believe in you." She was not wealthy, but she was rich in faith, and sometimes faith is more precious than gold. She began to sell what little she had, her boutique, her wedding jewelry, even the silk wrapper her late mother gave her on her wedding day. Neighbors shook their heads, calling her foolish, but Adanna held on to Percy's hand with trembling determination, telling herself that one day, the same people who mocked her would clap their hands in admiration. In her heart, she carried a silent vow. If this man fails, let it be after I have given everything in me to help him rise. And so with quiet steps, she walked into the valley of sacrifice, not knowing that every coin she gave, every jewel she sold, and every prayer she whispered was sowing seeds that would one day grow into both glory and betrayal. The land her late father left her was not much, a small patch of earth on the edge of town, barren and overlooked, but it carried the weight of memory and legacy. Adanna wept when she mortgaged it, not because she doubted her husband, but because she knew she was laying down the last shield between her family name and the winds of uncertainty. Still, she signed the papers with trembling fingers and a stubborn smile, whispering under her breath, "Let this seed yield fruit." Percy kissed her forehead and promised her a life of abundance, a future where she would ride in luxury cars and sleep under roofs of marble. His words tasted like honey, and Adanna swallowed them whole, believing love's promises as though they were holy scripture. With the new funds, Percy's logistics business crawled out of the dirt. They rented their first truck, and Adanna herself helped load and offload goods, her wrapper tied firmly, her hands blistered, her back bent, yet her heart beating with pride. She was not ashamed, for she told herself that sweat was temporary, but legacy was forever. Every receipt signed, every delivery completed, felt like bricks being laid on the foundation of a palace they were building together. But even as the seed was planted, shadows lingered nearby. Percy's laughter began to change. It no longer carried the warmth of a man grateful to his wife, but the pride of a man beginning to believe that the world owed him worship. Adanna, blinded by love, did not see it then. She thought his arrogance was simply confidence. Yet in the silence of her heart, a soft voice whispered that seeds planted in sacrifice could bloom into flowers of betrayal if watered with pride. The trucks multiplied. The name of Percy Logistics began to echo in markets and offices, and the man who once begged for investors now dined with politicians and businessmen. Adanna watched with quiet joy as the empire she helped birth began to crawl, then walk, and finally run. At public gatherings, Percy shook hands, gave speeches, and soaked in applause, his smile stretching wider than she had ever seen. But while the world saw Percy's strength, few saw Adanna's blistered hands or weary eyes. She was the quiet architect, the silent laborer, the invisible backbone, and yet her name was never mentioned when Percy boasted of his achievements. At first, she excused him. "It is enough that I know," she told herself. But as time passed, her husband's humility began to wither. He returned home less often, his laughter echoing more with strangers than with the woman who once stood by him. Their one-room home transformed into a mansion, yet the bed they shared grew colder. Neighbors still whispered her name in admiration, calling her the woman of sacrifice, but in Percy's mouth, her name had become an afterthought. And yet, Adanna's love did not die. She reminded herself that sometimes men lose themselves in success, but eventually remember their roots. She continued to cook for him, to wait for him late into the night, to smile when he walked through the door, even though he barely looked at her. She told herself this was the storm before peace, not knowing that peace had already left their home, and another storm was waiting to enter. It began subtly, like cracks in a wall no one notices until they widen. Percy's mother, once polite, began to drop sharp comments. A successful man should not walk beside a woman who dresses like a market seller. Adanna smiled through the pain, but inside, her heart bled. What cut deeper was Percy's silence. He never defended her, never spoke against his mother's sharp tongue. Instead, he began to agree in small, subtle ways. A frown when she wore her old wrapper, a sigh when she joined him at parties in her simple gowns. Adanna stood before the mirror one night, staring at her reflection. Weary eyes, calloused hands, faded clothes. She whispered to herself, "Maybe I have given too much. Maybe in helping him rise, I forgot to rise with him." But love has a way of silencing doubt. She wiped her tears, adjusted her scarf, and told herself tomorrow would be better. But tomorrow brought more whispers, more comparisons, more laughter at her expense. Percy began to keep company with glamorous women in his office and at events, and Adanna felt like a shadow in her own marriage. Still, she clung to hope. For love, she told herself, is not about the easy seasons. It is about holding on through storms. Little did she know, this storm was not one she would weather beside him, but one he would use to wash her away. Her name was Abigail, smooth-skinned, sharp-eyed, and dangerous as a serpent wrapped in silk. She came into Percy's office as a business consultant, but her words were dipped in honey, and her laughter designed to ensnare. She flattered him in ways Adanna never thought necessary, feeding his ego until he believed her every whisper was truth. To Percy, Abigail was not just a woman. She was temptation dressed in perfection. At first, Adanna noticed little things. The way Percy's eyes lit up when his phone buzzed. The way he returned home with Abigail's perfume clinging to his shirt. The way he dismissed Adanna's questions with irritation. One evening, she overheard him say to her friend, "Adanna is too simple, too backward. Abigail is the kind of woman who fits my status." The words pierced her heart like knives, but she swallowed her pain, too weary to argue. In the midst of this storm, Adanna discovered something that should have been a moment of joy. She was carrying life within her. A child, their child. But instead of rejoicing, she felt fear. Fear that Percy, blinded by Abigail's beauty, would reject not only her, but the child too. So she kept her secret, cradling her belly in silence, praying that the baby would one day be her comfort when the world turned its back. And so, as Abigail's shadow grew taller in their home, Adanna's secret grew quietly within her womb, like a hidden weapon of destiny waiting for its time. There are betrayals that cut like sharp knives, but the one that comes from family carves wounds that never fully heal. Adanna had always known that Percy's mother, Mama Iphioma, carried seeds of disapproval in her heart, but she never expected those seeds to bloom into open contempt. At a family gathering, under the warm lights and curious eyes of relatives, Mama Iphioma clasped Abigail's hand and said loudly, "Now this is the kind of woman who suits my son. Beauty, class, the kind of grace that makes a man proud to introduce her as his wife." Adanna froze, her breath caught between shock and humiliation, as laughter filled the room like cruel music. Percy, instead of silencing his mother or defending the woman who had carried his burdens and bled for his dreams, simply smiled sheepishly, as though agreeing silently with her words. The betrayal was not only in his silence, but in the way his eyes lingered on Abigail, as if she were already wearing the crown of wifehood. That night, Adanna sat alone in their vast bedroom, staring at the tall mirror that reflected a woman she no longer recognized. Her clothes were simple, her hands bore the marks of labor, and her eyes were tired. She remembered the girl she once was, full of dreams, dressed in color, glowing with youth, a girl who believed marriage was the garden where dreams blossomed. Now, she looked like a wilted flower in a vase that no one bothered to water. She wondered if love demanded too much, if sacrifice had stolen her essence, leaving her bare, while Abigail sparkled in the jewels of vanity. She placed her hand gently on her womb, whispering, "You are my secret strength, my hidden joy. If the world rejects me, I will not let it reject you." Meanwhile, Percy became a stranger in his own home. He returned later and later, his words colder, his laughter warmer only in Abigail's company. Adanna's silence was not weakness, it was survival. She swallowed her pain like bitter herbs, each day telling herself it would pass, each day realizing more and more that the man she loved was drifting further into another woman's arms. And while the world clapped for Percy's success, Adanna's heart began to prepare for a storm she could neither stop nor run from. It was a night that began like any other, but ended like none she had ever known. Percy returned home in a storm of rage, his face hardened, his voice carrying a venom that felt foreign. Adanna had only asked a simple question, why he came home smelling of perfume that was not hers. Instead of answering, he erupted, shouting words so cruel they tore through her chest like arrows. "You are awake, Adanna, a dull woman who has dragged me long enough. I need a wife who matches my destiny, not a market woman pretending to be a queen. Get out. Tonight, Abigail takes her rightful place." His voice thundered in the mansion walls, and before she could comprehend the full cruelty of his words, his hands were on her clothes, dragging her toward the door. Adanna begged, her voice breaking into pieces, not because she could not live without him, but because she feared where she would go with nothing. Rain pounded the earth outside as though the heavens themselves mourned with her. Percy flung her bag at her feet, a small bag with only a few clothes inside, hurriedly packed by the housemaid who avoided Adanna's eyes. And then, with one final push, he hurled her into the night, the heavy gates of the mansion closing behind her like the sound of destiny slamming shut. Through the iron bars, she caught one last glimpse of Abigail's painted lips curving into a smirk, her hand resting casually on Percy's shoulder as though to say, "The throne is mine now." The rain soaked her hair, her wrapper clung to her skin, and her bare feet splashed through puddles as she stumbled into the darkness. She pressed her hands to her belly, feeling the fragile life within her whispering, "Hold on, my child. We will survive this night." Each step she took away from the mansion was heavy with grief, but also lit with a faint spark of a destiny she could not yet see. In that moment, she was no longer a wife cast out. She was a woman stripped to nothing, standing at the doorway of rebirth. When all doors closed, the church became the only open gate. Adanna, drenched and trembling, found her way to the compound of a small neighborhood church, where the night watchman took pity on her and offered a wooden bench to rest her head. That night she did not sleep, she wept. She wept until her tears formed rivers, until her chest ached with the weight of betrayal. Every sacrifice replayed in her mind like cruel theater, the jewelry she pawned, the boutique she sold, the land she mortgaged, the meals she skipped so Percy could eat. She wept not only for what she had lost, but for the humiliation of being replaced by a woman who brought nothing but beauty and deceit. Days turned into weeks, and she remained in the church, helping the women's fellowship clean the pews and cook for members. She was given a corner of the compound to lay her mat, and though it was humble, it became her sanctuary. At night, when silence wrapped the compound, she would kneel in prayer, her hands pressed to her growing belly, whispering to her unborn child, "You are the reason I will rise again. I will not let the cruelty of men destroy me while you are yet to see this world." Her faith became her shield, and though she carried sorrow, she also carried a spark that suffering could not extinguish. Whispers of her story reached the ears of the women in the cooperative society, women who had once mocked her but now pitied her resilience. They offered her a chance, a small loan, a seed to rebuild from ashes. With trembling hands and a heart determined to survive, Adanna accepted. She realized that life was not going to hand her pity. It demanded that she rise with her own hands, even if those hands were blistered and empty. Her first business was not grand. It was a battered aluminum pot, a charcoal stove, and a corner of the church kitchen. But from that humble beginning, something extraordinary was born. Adanna cooked meals that carried more than spice. They carried soul, pain, and hope. The aroma of her jollof rice, the tenderness of her pepper soup, the flavor of her beans. They were not just food, but stories of survival. Soon workers from nearby offices and traders from the market began to line up at the church gates, coins in hand, eager to taste the magic of her resilience. With every plate she served, Adanna whispered a silent vow. This is not just food. This is my answer to betrayal. Her womb grew heavier, her belly swelling with life, and yet she worked tirelessly, sometimes through pain and dizziness, refusing to let weakness conquer her. Slowly, her savings grew. She moved from cooking in the church kitchen to renting a small kiosk. She bought new pots, hired 2 young girls from the church to assist her, and painted the wooden sign that read in bold letters, Adanna's Place. What Percy meant for shame had become her foundation. The same neighbors who once laughed at her sacrifice now marveled at her determination. They whispered, "This woman has a grace that refuses to die." Adanna, though weary and scarred, began to see a glimpse of destiny's hand at work. She was no longer just surviving. She was rising quietly but surely, while Percy remained blind to the storm gathering against him. Meanwhile, in the grand mansion, Abigail reigned like a queen, but her reign was poisoned by greed. She urged Percy to throw lavish parties, to travel to Dubai for shopping sprees, to invest recklessly in businesses she had no knowledge of. Percy, intoxicated by her beauty and blinded by her flattery, listened without question. Slowly, the empire he built on Adanna's sacrifices began to bleed. Trucks broke down from neglect, clients withdrew because of missed deliveries, and debts began to whisper at his door. But each time, Abigail silenced his worries with kisses and silk sheets, assuring him that money was endless and power eternal. What Percy did not know was that Abigail had begun weaving another web. She grew closer to Topchi, Percy's most trusted friend, the man who had been by his side since childhood. At first it seemed like innocent companionship, but soon whispers turned to laughter, laughter to secrets, and secrets to plans. Together, Abigail and Topchi began siphoning money, transferring shares, and preparing for a life Percy would never be part of. Percy, blind in his arrogance, never noticed the betrayal unfolding right under his nose. And while Abigail played her games and Percy bathed in vanity, Adanna's world was expanding. She was still a whisper in the city, still invisible to the elite. But destiny was already setting the stage for the day when the woman who was cast into the rain would become the storm that no one could ignore. The day her labor pains began, Adanna was stirring a pot of egusi soup, her apron drenched in sweat, her mind occupied not with fear, but with determination. She had no luxury, no husband by her side, no gilded hospital room, only the humble maternity ward of the church clinic and the prayers of the women's fellowship. Hours of pain carved valleys in her face, but when the cry of her son pierced the night, she wept, not in sorrow but in triumph. She named him Kamsi, meaning as I asked God. For Adanna, he was more than a child. He was a living reminder that though men may abandon, heaven never forgets. Holding him against her chest, she whispered, "You will not know shame. You will be the face of my rise." Days turned into weeks, and Adanna, though weakened by childbirth, returned to her pots and stoves. She strapped Kamsi to her back and cooked with fire in her spirit. Customers would marvel at her endurance, a woman who, despite nursing a newborn, served food with the excellence of a queen. Word spread quickly. There was a place where food tasted like hope, where a woman's tears had seasoned every plate. Soon, business people, teachers, and traders all found their way to her kiosk, and each coin dropped into her hand was not just profit, but a piece of her dignity being restored. Her savings grew steadily, and her kiosk expanded into a proper eatery. She painted the sign anew, Adanna's Place. The wooden signboard stood proudly like a banner of triumph. She hired more women, trained them, and paid them fairly, insisting her business would be built on honor, not exploitation. Her baby's laughter echoed through the eatery, giving her strength when fatigue threatened to break her. What began as a woman cooking from ashes had now become a beacon of resilience, and destiny was only beginning to unveil her crown. It was not long before whispers of her eatery spread beyond her neighborhood. Her meals found their way onto the tongues of men in suits, women in heels, and even government workers who traveled miles just to taste the magic of her cooking. The food was rich, yes, but what captured people was the aura of Adanna herself. There was something unexplainable about her presence, quiet dignity, silent pain, and a strength that commanded respect. She was not selling meals. She was serving resilience plated with grace. In the corners of her mind, she often wondered if Percy had heard the whispers, if Abigail had tasted envy. But she never spoke his name again, never allowed bitterness to poison the sweetness of her eyes. One evening, while she closed the accounts in her small office, she received an envelope. Inside was a check with enough figures to make her gasp, signed simply with the words, "From someone who believes in you." At first, she thought it was a mistake, but more checks followed, each one larger than the last. With them, she expanded her business into multiple branches across Lagos. She wondered often about the mysterious benefactor, but destiny hid the truth until the time was ripe. It was Percy's estranged elder sister, a woman who had watched silently as her brother mocked and cast out Adanna, and who decided to invest in the very woman he had despised, if only to prove that true queens rise in silence. With the new funds, Adanna's place became a household name. Billboards bore her logo, newspapers carried her story, and she was invited to business forums as a woman of inspiration. In every speech she gave, she never mentioned Percy nor Abigail. She spoke only of perseverance, prayer, and the dignity of work. She let the world think her story was simply about a woman's hustle, but deep in her heart, she knew it was about more. It was about betrayal turning into firewood for a greater destiny. While Adanna's empire expanded, Percy's began to decay. His once busy warehouses grew silent, his trucks parked idle, gathering dust. Clients began to pull out, citing missed deadlines and careless mistakes. He blamed everyone but himself, accusing his staff of incompetence, his managers of laziness, but never once admitting that he had allowed Abigail's vanity to dictate his decisions. The parties grew louder even as his accounts grew emptier, and the whispers of creditors became like drums in the night. Still he walked with arrogance, convinced his wealth was untouchable, blind to the quicksand beneath his feet. Abigail, meanwhile, fanned the flames of destruction. She encouraged him to borrow more, to impress business partners with extravagance he could not afford. When Percy complained, she silenced him with kisses, whispering, "Don't worry, love, the money will always flow." But behind closed doors, her laughter was reserved for Tokchi, Percy's childhood friend and confidant. The man who once toasted to Percy's success now toasted secretly with Abigail, scheming how best to bleed him dry. Together, they forged documents, siphoned funds, and secured company shares in Abigail's name, while Percy lived in ignorance, intoxicated by lust and ego. What Adanna had built for him with blood and sacrifice was being squandered daily, and yet he did not remember her. He never once thought of the woman who once walked in the rain for him. But destiny does not forget, and soon the consequences of his blindness would come crashing like a storm, stripping him bare until the only name left standing would be the one he spat upon, Adanna's. The day Percy discovered the truth was the day his pride collapsed. He had gone to the bank to secure a loan to save his dying empire, only to be told that his shares had been transferred into Abigail's name. Confused and trembling, he rushed home, only to find Abigail's closet emptied, her perfume gone, her laughter erased from the walls. Beside her absence was a letter, short and merciless. "You gave me everything, but Tokchi gave me more. Don't bother looking for us. We've taken what we need." His knees buckled, his chest caved in, and for the first time in years, Percy wept like a child. The empire he had chosen over Adanna had been stolen not by strangers, but by the two people he trusted most. The humiliation spread like wildfire. Business associates mocked him behind closed doors. Friends who once dined at his table now crossed the street to avoid him. And when he sought Tabechi's family for answers, they spat in his face, telling him he deserved his fate. Abigail and Topchi, meanwhile, had vanished abroad, living lavishly on the wealth he foolishly handed to them. Rumors surfaced that they even had a child together, and in a cruel twist, they named the boy Percy Jr., a permanent scar on his pride. Alone, broken, and drowning in debt, Percy sat in the ruins of his mansion, staring at the empty chair where Adanna once sat. He realized too late that he had traded a diamond for stones, a queen for a serpent. But regret does not rewind destiny. The same rain that once soaked Adanna in exile was now falling on him. Only this time, there was no roof of love to shield him. Desperation drives a man into madness, and Percy's madness took him to the courts. One morning, newspapers carried a shocking headline: "Businessman Percy demands ownership of ex-wife's restaurant chain." He had filed a case claiming that since Adanna once used money from their marriage to start her catering, Adanna's place was partly his. The arrogance stunned the city. The same man who threw her out, who mocked her simplicity, who replaced her with a mistress, now demanded to eat from the fruit of her resilience. Adanna, upon hearing the news, did not rage. She simply smiled bitterly and prepared herself for the theater of humiliation that awaited him. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, business rivals, and curious onlookers filled every seat. Percy, once a man who commanded fear, now stood nervously before the judge, his once pristine suit hanging loosely on his shrinking frame. He spoke with desperation, his words tumbling like a drowning man grasping at straws. But Adanna, dressed in calm elegance, sat quietly, her presence radiating dignity. When the judge delivered the verdict, it was as though thunder had struck. "This court finds Mr. Percy's claims baseless and shameless. You abandoned this woman, and she built her empire without you. Case dismissed with disgrace." The courtroom erupted in whispers, laughter, and clapping. Percy stood frozen, his face pale, as cameras flashed mercilessly. His shame was immortalized in headlines, his arrogance crushed under the weight of justice. And Adanna, without lifting her voice, without uttering an insult, had won not just the case, but the silent war of dignity. The woman who was cast out had now become the standard by which resilience was measured, and Percy had become the warning of what pride can destroy. Life has a way of arranging scenes more dramatic than any playwright could conceive, and destiny loves irony. When Adanna was nominated for Entrepreneur of the Year, she did not see it as a personal victory alone, but as a testimony that ashes could indeed bloom into crowns. The event was grand. Chandeliers glittered, cameras flashed, and Lagos' most powerful gathered to applaud the woman who had once been mocked as too ordinary. Yet the cruel twist of fate made the moment sweeter. The guest of honor who was supposed to present the award canceled last minute, and the organizers, desperate for a replacement, chose a man who had once been a giant in business, but was now humbled, Percy. He walked to the stage in a wrinkled suit, his once confident stride now a hesitant shuffle, and when his eyes met Adanna's, the hall fell into a hush thick with tension. Adanna rose from her seat, her dress flowing like water, her aura radiating dignity. Every camera turned to her, every eye watched in awe as the woman once cast into the rain walked with grace toward the stage. Percy's hands trembled as he held the plaque, his lips dry, his heart pounding with shame. And in front of everyone, with cameras capturing every second, he was forced to hand the golden award to the woman he had once thrown into the street. The hall erupted in applause, but hidden in that applause was laughter. Laughter at his humiliation, admiration at her resilience. Adanna accepted the award without prideful gloating. She simply bowed her head in gratitude and whispered into the microphone, "This is for every woman who was told she was not enough." The symbolism of that moment pierced Percy deeper than 1,000 insults. He had built an empire on her sacrifices, destroyed it with his arrogance, and now, in the very arena where he once shone, he was reduced to a prop in her glory. Destiny had orchestrated the scene not for Adanna to boast, but to prove that no betrayal, no matter how bitter, could silence the power of a woman determined to rise. In the months that followed, Adanna's empire grew even larger. Adanna's place spread across Lagos and beyond, branches opening in Abuja, Port Harcourt, and Accra. Each branch carried the same aura, not just food, but soul. Her story became a sermon in churches, a case study in universities, and an anthem among women who had been told their worth ended at sacrifice. She was no longer just a businesswoman. She was a symbol, a walking testimony that resilience can rewrite destiny. She bought back the very piece of land she once mortgaged for Percy, this time building a training center for young women who wanted to learn both cooking and business. Where Percy had seen failure, she created legacy. Meanwhile, Percy's ashes lay scattered. Creditors hounded him like wolves. Banks closed their doors on him, and men who once bowed before him now mocked him in whispers. He sold his mansion to pay debts, reduced to living in a rented flat far smaller than the one-room apartment he and Adanna once shared. He walked the streets unrecognized, stripped of the aura of power that once clung to him. At night, he sat alone in silence, haunted by the echo of Adanna's laughter that once filled his home, the memory of her hands stirring pots for him, the vision of her eyes glowing with belief in him. Regret became his shadow, following him even in sleep. And yet, Adanna never spoke ill of him. When reporters asked her about Percy, she replied only with, "I wish him peace." She did not need to curse him. Life had already written its judgment in bold letters. The palace he threw her out of had turned to ruins, while the ashes she was cast into had transformed into a kingdom. It was not revenge that fueled her, it was purpose, and purpose had made her untouchable. In desperation, Percy attempted to find solace in the very woman for whom he had abandoned his wife. He scraped together what little dignity he had left and sought out Abigail. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. He discovered not only that she had married Tobchi, his closest friend, but that they were living lavishly abroad with the wealth they had stolen from him. Worse still, they had named their son Percy Jr. To the world it was just a name, but to Percy it was mockery immortalized in flesh. Each time he heard it whispered, he felt as though a dagger twisted in his heart. Abigail sent him a message through mutual acquaintances, dripping with venom. "Thank you for funding my real happiness. You were a ladder, Percy, and ladders are only useful until one climbs high enough." He read those words again and again until they burned into his soul. For the first time, he understood the depth of his foolishness. He had abandoned loyalty for lust, traded sacrifice for vanity, and given his crown to those who only sought to strip him bare. The betrayal by Abigail cut him deeply, but the betrayal by Tobchi, the man he called brother, destroyed him completely. Bitter, broken, and mocked by the very shadows he once pursued, Percy descended into obscurity. No one answered his calls, no one visited his home, and even his mother, who once praised Abigail, now cursed her son's downfall. The same woman who supported his betrayal of Adanna now found herself begging at Adanna's office door, seeking loans to feed herself. Destiny was not blind. It had simply been patient, waiting for the perfect moment to show that the proud who mocked sacrifice would one day bow before it. It was Kamsi, now a little boy with bright eyes and a curious spirit, who insisted on knowing his father. "Mama," he said one evening, "everyone in school has a father who comes for visiting day. Where is mine?" Adanna's heart broke, but she could not deny him forever. When news reached her that Percy had fallen gravely ill and was admitted to a government hospital, she took Kamsi by the hand and went to him. The ward smelled of medicine and despair, and when Percy looked up and saw her, tears flooded his eyes. He had seen her in newspapers, on television, on billboards, but seeing her in person again, elegant, radiant, untouchable, crushed him completely. Adanna did not come as a bitter woman seeking to gloat, but as a mother honoring her son's request. She stood by Percy's bed, her face calm, her heart steady, while Kamsi approached timidly and said, "Papa." The word, so small and innocent, broke Percy into sobs. He reached out with trembling hands and touched the boy's face, realizing that he had missed the chance to watch his own child's first steps, to hear his first words, to witness his growth. In that single moment, The weight of all his mistakes pressed down upon him like an ocean. Adanna said nothing cruel, nothing sharp. Her silence was more powerful than any insult. She stood like a queen, granting mercy, allowing her son to meet the man who once cast her aside. And in that silence, Percy realized that true power was not in wealth or fame, but in dignity, in grace, in resilience. He wept not only for what he had lost, but for what he could never regain. The final days of Percy's life were marked not by grandeur, but by solitude. He had no empire, no mistress, no friends. Only Adanna and Camseed visited him, and even then it was not out of obligation, but out of mercy. One evening, when the sun painted the sky with its last golden strokes, Percy summoned the last of his strength and whispered, "Adanna, I wronged you. You gave me everything, and I gave you nothing but pain. Forgive me." His voice cracked, his chest heaved, and his tears soaked the sheets. Adanna looked at him, the man who once towered in arrogance, now reduced to a frail shadow, and her heart ached, not in love, but in the sorrow of wasted destiny. She bent slightly, her voice calm yet firm, and said, "You threw me out to build her palace. But while you wasted your kingdom, I built mine from ashes." Her words were not vindictive. They were truth, the final judgment of a life lived foolishly. Percy closed his eyes, clutching Camsee's small hand, and breathed his last breath with tears streaming down his cheeks. His story ended not in triumph, not in power, but in regret, a caution written in flesh and blood. Adanna walked out of the hospital ward that night with Camsee holding her hand, her head high, her step steady. She did not look back. The world outside was waiting, the empire she had built still blossoming, the legacy she had carved out of betrayal shining like a lamp. She had been cast into the fire, but she came out gold. And though the man who betrayed her had turned to dust, her story would live forever as proof that no rejection, no humiliation, no betrayal can bury the destiny of a woman who refuses to bow. Please like, share, and subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching to the end. Don't forget to come back for the next amazing tale yet.